A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You ever think about what it takes to actually build a nuclear program from the ground up? Most people focus on the hardware. The centrifuges spinning at supersonic speeds, the heavy water reactors, or the deep underground bunkers at sites like Fordow that are designed to withstand a direct hit from a bunker buster. But when you strip all that concrete and steel away, what you are left with is a group of people sitting in a room with a lot of chalkboards and some very high-end computers. Today's prompt from Daniel is about those people, the human capital behind Iran's nuclear ambitions, especially in the wake of the military strikes we have seen over the last year. It is a question of whether the scientist is a patriot, a prisoner, or a target.
It is the ultimate dual-use problem, corn. My name is Herman Poppleberry, and I have been obsessively looking at the data coming out of the International Atomic Energy Agency over the last few days. We are sitting here on March 22nd, 2026, and the landscape is fundamentally different than it was even a year ago. We have had Operation Midnight Hammer in June of 2025 and Operation Epic Fury just this past February. The physical infrastructure has been battered, but as Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the agency, pointed out just 2 days ago on March 20th, the technical know-how is still very much intact. You can bomb a building, but you cannot bomb the equations out of a physicist's head.
That is the part that always gets me. We talk about these strikes like they are a reset button, but if the people who designed the system are still walking around, how much of a reset is it really? Daniel's prompt gets into the ethics of this. Are these guys the black sheep of the scientific community? I mean, if you are a nuclear physicist, there are plenty of ways to spend your career that do not involve helping a regime, like the one in Tehran, get closer to a bomb. It is the paradox of the nuclear scientist, a career built on fundamental physics that can lead to either clean energy for millions, or a geopolitical bullseye on your back.
To understand this, we have to look at the current state of play. On March 19th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed that Iran has essentially lost its enrichment and missile production capabilities due to the recent strikes. But almost immediately, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, countered by offering to dilute Iran's remaining 60% enriched uranium stockpile in exchange for full sanctions relief. That is a massive tell. It says, "We will give you the material because we know we can make more." And that confidence comes from the talent pipeline at places like Sharif University of Technology.
Sharif University. I have heard it called the MIT of Iran. That is where this all starts, right? Before we get into the black sheep debate, let's talk about how these guys even get into the program. Daniel asked if they are coerced, or if they are offered outlandish benefits. From what I have seen, it is a bit of both, but the benefit side is surprisingly sophisticated. It is not just about a paycheck, it is about a lifestyle that is almost impossible to find elsewhere in a sanctioned economy.
The Iranian state has essentially gamified the recruitment process. If you are a brilliant student at Sharif, the state makes it very easy to say yes and very difficult to say no. We are talking about elite status. You get state-funded housing in secured compounds, which is a huge deal in Tehran. You get salaries that are triple or quadruple what a standard university professor makes. But the big one, the one that really hooks young men, is the exemption from mandatory military service. In Iran, that is a 2-year commitment that can be brutal. If you join the nuclear program, you are exempt. You go straight from the classroom to a high-prestige, high-paying job.
But it is a gilded cage. You get the apartment and the salary, but you are essentially a ward of the state. I was reading about the internal surveillance. Once you are in the program, you are under 24-hour watch. There are strict travel bans. You cannot just take your PhD and go work for a tech startup in Dubai or a research lab in Europe. If you try to step away, they have a term for it: white defection. It is what the internal security services call it when a scientist tries to quietly move into a less sensitive field out of fear. And they do not take kindly to it.
The white defection concept is fascinating because it highlights the psychological pressure. The regime frames nuclear research not as a weaponization project, but as a matter of indigenous knowledge and national sovereignty. This is how they bypass the moral pressure from the international community. They tell these scientists, this is not about a bomb, this is about Iran's right to be a modern scientific nation. The West wants to keep us in the Dark Ages, and you are the ones holding the torch. When you frame it as an act of patriotic resistance, it makes the ethical black sheep argument much harder to stick.
Let's pull on that black sheep thread for a second. Daniel specifically asked if the global scientific community views these guys as outcasts. If you are a physicist in London or Tokyo, how do you look at a colleague in Natanz? Is there a formal mechanism to say you are no longer a scientist because of who you work for?
It is incredibly messy. There is no global board of physics that can strip you of your credentials. The closest thing we have is the World Nuclear Association's Charter of Ethics, but it is mostly aspirational. It emphasizes peaceful use, but it does not have teeth. Then you have the Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs. They were founded in the 1950s to think about the social responsibility of scientists in the nuclear age. Their argument is that a scientist has a moral obligation to ensure their work benefits humanity. But many physicists argue that math and physics are neutral. They say, I am just uncovering the laws of nature. It is the politicians who decide whether to use those laws for a reactor or a warhead.
That neutrality argument feels a bit thin when you're enriching uranium to 60%, though. As we have discussed in previous episodes, specifically episode 509, if you want the deep dive on the physics of proliferation, once you hit 60%, you have already done 99% of the separative work required to get to weapons grade 90%. You do not get to 60% by accident while trying to make medical isotopes. Everyone in that room knows what the end goal is.
That is the crux of the ethical dilemma. How does a scientist reconcile their academic training, which is all about the open exchange of ideas, with the reality of being a military asset? In Iran, the regime has successfully merged those two identities. They have turned nuclear science into a sort of elite priesthood, but it is a priesthood with a very high mortality rate. Since 2007, we have seen about 25 Iranian nuclear scientists killed in various operations. 14 of them were killed just last June during Operation Midnight Hammer. That is a staggering attrition rate for an academic field.
14 in one go. That includes some heavy hitters, too. We are talking about Feridun Abbasi Davani, the former head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, and Mohammad Mehdi Tehranchi, who ran Islamic Azad University. Those were not just guys in lab coats. They were the administrators who kept the talent pipeline moving. When you lose the guy who manages the talent, you start to see real friction in the recruitment process. It makes me wonder how a student at Sharif University looks at those names. Do they see martyrs or do they see a cautionary tale?
The regime works very hard to make sure they see martyrs. They hold these massive state funerals, they name streets after them, and they use their deaths as a recruitment tool. They tell the students, these men were murdered by the West because they were too brilliant, because they were making Iran too strong. It creates a siege mentality. And as we know from history, a siege mentality is a powerful motivator. It can actually make the program more resilient.
This brings us to the targeting debate, which is one of the most controversial parts of this whole story. Daniel's prompt mentions a 2025 bibliometric study about the effectiveness of targeting scientists. Herman, you looked into this. Does killing the scientist actually stop the program?
The short answer, according to that study, is no. The researchers looked at the scientific output of the Iranian nuclear program before and after major assassinations, like the one of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh years ago. What they found was that while an individual's specific expertise is lost, the institutional knowledge is now so decentralized that the overall output only dips for a few months. It is like a hydra. You cut off one head and the system compensates. This is why Rafael Grossi is so worried right now. Even if the buildings at Natanz and Fordau are rubble, the brain trust is still there. They are likely in smaller, clandestine labs right now, using the data they saved before the bombs fell to figure out their next move.
So the surgical strike on human capital might not be as surgical as people think. If the goal is to stop the program without causing massive civilian fallout, targeting the people seems like the logical step. But if it does not actually stop the train, then what are we doing? It feels like we are just escalating the cycle of violence without achieving the strategic goal.
It is a failed counter-proliferation strategy in many ways. In fact, you could argue it backfires. When you kill the older, perhaps more moderate leaders like Tehranchi, you create a vacuum that is often filled by younger, more radicalized scientists. These are the guys who have grown up in this environment of constant shadow war. They do not see themselves as academics who happen to work for the state, they see themselves as soldiers in a laboratory. They are more committed, more paranoid, and more likely to push for a breakout because they feel they have nothing left to lose.
That is a terrifying thought. A generation of physicists who see the periodic table as a weapon system. It changes the nature of the conversation entirely. If the global scientific community wants to address this, they have to find a way to offer these people an off-ramp. But how do you do that when the regime has their families under surveillance? We have seen programs over the years to encourage defection, but they are incredibly risky. Most scientists are not going to leave their parents or their children behind to live in a safe house in Virginia. The regime knows this, so they use the families as the ultimate leverage.
It is intellectual kidnapping, plain and simple, and it is working well enough to keep the program on life support. One of the most concerning things in the March 4th report from the E3 France, Germany, and the United Kingdom is that inspectors have been barred from the damaged sites for over 8 months. If the IAEA cannot talk to the scientists and cannot see the sites, we are essentially flying blind. We are relying on satellite photos of rubble, but we have no idea what is happening in the minds of the people who are tasked with rebuilding that rubble.
This is where we need to shift our perspective. We have to stop thinking about nuclear proliferation as just a problem of plumbing and chemistry. It is a problem of psychology and human capital. If we do not understand what motivates these people, whether it is the housing, the nationalism, or the fear, we are never going to be able to actually stop the program. We are just playing a very expensive game of whack-a-mole with centrifuges.
And we have to be realistic about the impact of the strikes. Operation Midnight Hammer and Operation Epic Fury were massive successes from a military standpoint. They did things that people thought were impossible 5 years ago. But they did not solve the human problem. In fact, they might have made the human problem more acute. Iran has some of the most experienced centrifuge technicians in the world because they have been dealing with Stuxnet, sabotage, and airstrikes for 20 years. They are the best in the world at rebuilding broken systems. That is a form of expertise you only get through conflict.
It is like a 20-year crash course in resilient engineering. Every time we try to break their toys, they learn how to build them better and hide them deeper. It makes me think back to episode 7016 where we talked about the precision of these strikes. We can hit a specific room in a specific building, but we cannot hit the know-how.
And that know-how is a permanent asset. Once a nation crosses that threshold of understanding, they are a nuclear threshold state forever. You cannot unlearn how to enrich uranium. This is why the diplomatic impasse is so dangerous. Abbas Arakchi is offering to dilute the stockpile, but he is not offering to delete the blueprints. He knows that as long as the scientists are alive and the talent pipeline at Sharif University is full, the material is replaceable.
So, what are the takeaways for our listeners? When you see a headline that says a nuclear site has been destroyed, you need to look for the word know-how in the follow-up reports. If the IAEA says the know-how is intact, the program is not dead, it is just in hibernation.
Another takeaway is to watch the brain drain metrics. If we start to see a real exodus of scientists from Iran, not just white defection but actual departures, then we will know the strategy of pressure is working. But as long as the regime can keep the seats full at Sharif University through a mix of incentives and coercion, the program has a future. We also need to think about the ethical responsibility of universities outside of Iran. A lot of these scientists get part of their training or access to research from international journals and conferences. Should there be a more concerted effort to block that access?
That is a double-edged sword, though. If you cut off the flow of information, you might slow them down slightly, but you also ensure that the only information they get is from the regime. Open science is usually a tool for transparency. When you close those doors, you create a black box. And as we have seen, Iran is very good at working inside a black box.
It really comes down to the human element. The most dangerous weapon in Iran is not a missile, it is a PhD with nothing to lose. We have to look at the people if we want to understand the future of global security. The fact that inspectors have been barred for 8 months is the real red flag. It means the human capital is working in the dark, and that is where the most dangerous developments usually happen.
It is a high-stakes game of chess where the pieces are actual human beings. I feel for the guy who just wanted to study quantum mechanics and ends up in a bunker at Fordo wondering if a bunker buster is coming through the ceiling today. It is a bizarre and terrifying way to live a life. You are treated like a king by the state until the day you are treated like a martyr. There is no middle ground.
And as we move further into 2026, with the fallout from Epic Fury still settling, the pressure on these scientists is only going to increase. The regime needs them to produce a win to justify the losses they have taken. That probably means more aggressive enrichment or more secret facilities. It is a cycle that does not seem to have an endpoint.
I think we have covered a lot of ground here. Daniel's prompt really pushed us to look at the intersection of ethics, physics, and geopolitics in a way we usually don't. It is easy to talk about kilograms of uranium. It is much harder to talk about the motivations of the person who produced it.
It was a great prompt. It forced us to bridge the gap between the technical side of proliferation, which we covered in episode 509, and the military side, which we looked at in episode 716. This human side is the missing piece of the puzzle.
Well, that is our deep dive for today. We are looking at the world as it is, not as we wish it was, and the reality is that the human capital of Iran's nuclear program is its most resilient and most dangerous asset.
A sobering thought, but a necessary one. Thanks for sticking with us through this one, everyone.
Before we hop off, we want to give a big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We could not do this without that technical backbone.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these discussions valuable, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It is the best way to help new people find the show.
You can also find our full archive and search for specific topics at myweirdprobs.com. We have over 1,400 episodes in there now, so there is plenty to dig into.
All right, Herman. I think that is a wrap for today.
Till next time, Corn.
Take care, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth